Hi, Tim Millard here, host of The Extras, and what you're going to see here are different sections from our recent podcast of our special Halloween episode with special guests George Felsenstein from the Warner Archive, Dr. Steve Haberman, and Konstantin Nasser, both of who are terrific film historians. And they came on to talk about 3 different films, but I'm going to split those up so that you can watch them in a little smaller bites. In this video, we're talking about The Return of Dr. X from 1939, and it stars Humphrey Bogart in a horror role, which is unusual for him, of course, Wayne Morris, Dennis Morgan, and it was directed by Vincent Sherman in his directorial debut. Well, we have one more movie, and you mentioned Dr. X, Konstantin, and the movie now we're going to talk about is The Return of Dr. X from 1939. And Steve, you have a thread going back to the original commentary that was done with director Vincent Sherman on this for the DVD. Maybe you can take us back to when you did that and working and doing that commentary with him and your thoughts on that process and the film.
Okay, well, that was an unforgettable experience because Vincent Sherman was 100 years old, 100. And we went out, Constantine and the crew and me, and we went out to Woodland Hills, and we met with him, and he was in a 3-piece suit with a cane and a bow tie, and he was quite lovely and, still a handsome guy. You know, he had quite the reputation of being a dog in his great years, names like Joan Crawford, and he was not shy about mentioning it on the lowdown. But he had a great career with famous actresses, and he was not an auteur by any stretch of the imagination. He was a great craftsman. He did many different genres. He worked a lot with Humphrey Bogart. He did a lot of women's pictures when there was such a thing. And he was a pleasure, articulate. His memory was sharp. This was his first feature that he ever did. He had been a screenwriter and he'd been an actor, actually. He was a good looking enough guy to be an actor. And so he got, he drew the straw and had to do this contract horror movie, The Return of Dr. X. The reason the movie was made was that the horror genre had come to an end, really, with The Beast with Five Fingers for its first period. And the reason was because in England, which was a big market for horror films in the early 30s, the British Board of Censors was very offended by a lot of the stuff in horror films, because horror films were quite transgressive for the time and for now. They weren't graphic, they were reticent, but they were quite transgressive in terms of themes. I'm thinking about movies like Island of Lost Souls, which was, it dealt with bestiality and, as a subtext, and other topics that were unsavory. And even Paramount's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Oscar Wilde always said about the picture of Dorian Gray, he didn't want to say what Dorian Gray was doing to corrupt him. He wanted the reader to think that Dorian's sins were your sins, were the reader's sins. And they didn't have that attitude at Paramount when they made Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1931. They showed what Mr. Hyde's sins were, and they were pretty unsavory at the time, So anyway, the British Board of Censors got pretty fed up around 1935 with a couple of movies, Mad Love, the aforementioned Mad Love, and The Raven, especially, a Universal picture, which was just about a sadist, about a doctor who's obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe, and he's reconstructed Edgar Allan Poe's torture devices and uses them on people he hates. It was a very sadistic movie, and England said, "That's it, no more horror movies. We're not going to forget it. We're not going to import any more horror movies." So Universal and the other studios stopped making horror movies, and then a theater in, I believe it was in Beverly Hills, in 1937 or 38, got a couple of battered prints of Dracula and Frankenstein, and I think The Son of Kong or something. And they started showing these. This was a second or third run theater. And the lines were around the block. There hadn't been a new horror film in a couple of years. And people wanted to see that. And so Universal struck new prints of Dracula and Frankenstein, re-released it, made a big budget sequel, Son of Frankenstein, and horror was back. So even Jack Warner, who had an antipathy for the genre, said, "Well, I guess we got to make a horror film. We got to get a piece of this pie." So they decided to make this movie. It was based on a short story, which had nothing to do with their original Doctor X movie from 1932, and they did many drafts of the script. At one point, they were going to cast Boris Karloff, who was under contract, owed them a picture, and Bela Lugosi, who you could easily see Boris Karloff in Humphrey Bogart's part and Bela Lugosi in John Littell's part, and it would have been fine. But they decided not to spend the money just to use contract actors. So it was Humphrey Bogart in the part that they thought Karloff would have been good for, and John Littell, as I said, in Bela Lugosi's part. At one point, they were going to have Claude Rains play what John Littell ended up playing. Anyway, so they made this little movie and they gave it to Vincent Sherman. It was his first picture. And he liked to emphasize the comedy, which was, I'm sure, fine with Jack Warner, because if you look at Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum, not Walking Dead, but Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum, there's a lot of 1930s patter, and there's always a wisecracking reporter who's your protagonist that's taking you through all this unsavory material. And they did the same thing. That formula worked for them, and so they did it with Return of Dr. X. And it's actually it's a pretty good mystery. It's pretty intriguing, especially the first two acts before you know what's going on. You're wondering, what kind of movie is this exactly? At least there's no gangsters involved this time. There's a wisecracking reporter, but there's also a very serious. Wayne Morris plays the wisecracking reporter, and Dennis Morgan plays a very serious doctor who's very disturbed by some of these vampire goings on that seem to be happening in Manhattan, in modern Manhattan, modern as of 1939. So that's the story. And Humphrey Bogart, much to his chagrin, was cast as the monster, Dr. X, Dr. Xavier, who was executed for doing experiments on children where he wanted to see how long he could starve them. And he loses a child. And so they try him and they execute him for this. And Dr. Littell, Dr. John Littell, the doctor that he plays, has a way of bringing the dead back to life that involves electricity. And, fortunately, Humphrey Bogart had been electrocuted. And so he brings Humphrey Bogart back to life. There's only one caveat. He needs to have blood, and it has to be his specific blood type, which is type 1. They had 4 types in those days, and category 1 is what Humphrey Bogart had when he was alive. So he has to go around killing people and draining them of blood so that John Littell could put it in him. So it's pretty unsavory, like Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum, but it's done in this 1930s fast talking, reporter style. And Vincent Sherman emphasized the comedy part of it more than the horror, I think. And it turned out to be, it got great reviews when it came out, and it made money. It was a very inexpensive picture. They shot it in 3 weeks, and that's the return of Dr. X.
George, I know you mentioned it a little bit when we did the announcement for this, but tell us a little bit about how Humphrey Bogart felt about starring in this film.
He was not happy. Um, he was under contract. He did what they told him to do until he had his big breakthrough, a little bit with They Drive by Night, followed by High Sierra. That catapulted him into, basically leading man. Maltese Falcon cemented that. But up until those films, he was doing all sorts of roles, a lot of which he didn't like. In Virginia City, which is 1940, he plays a Mexican bandito. I mean, his accent is embarrassing. In Dark Victory, he's an Irish horse trainer, I think. They just had him do anything where, oh, let's use Bogart for this. He wasn't appreciated for his gifts and his talents. And finally, he broke through. And of course, I think if anybody thinks about Warner Brothers and classic leading men, if they're not thinking Cagney, they're thinking Bogart. Usually Bogart is number one.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. He wasn't bad, by the way, as Dr. X in this movie. You
Oh
know,
no, he's terrific.
yeah, he's actually quite good in it. I mean, his cynicism and his, his little lisp and his gravelly voice, it works extremely well. And they make him up. I mean, it's almost a parody of a vampire makeup, but it's quite effective on him. And he's genuinely scary in it. He didn't phone
Without
it in.
question.
He had
was
the
fully
hair
committed
for it
to
too.
his work. I said he was fully committed to the
Yeah.
work he was doing.
Yeah, right. He did. He was. I mean, he bitched and complained, and then he went and did it. But he did. He was very chilling in it. He could have had, if he hadn't made it as a gangster, he could have made it as a horror actor.
Oh, without question. The mind boggles at the thought.
Right?
But this is his only one, and you kind of again you wonder if it had done better than it was. But it was a, what you said, 3-week shoot. It was a Brian Foy production, and it was a B unit production. Why did they choose to do it and then not follow through? Obviously, there was the horror, resurrection in the late 30s, but why did Jack wait? Why was there not any other attempt in the 40s until Beast with Five Fingers? I mean, it took a few years for them even to get the Harvey novel or the Harvey short story. But they actually at that point, George, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it just really was a matter of it not being amongst Jack's personal taste. Because he was, he oversaw all production. He had people working under him, but he ultimately made the decisions. And this wasn't his cup of tea.
Yeah, they weren't looking for horror properties. They had no, except for Peter Lorre, who occasionally was a horror star. They didn't really have anybody set up there for horror. He didn't like horror. I don't think they were looking for the properties. I don't know how they stumbled on the short story Beast with Five Fingers. Somebody liked it at Warner Brothers.
But it seems like, if Foy had produced Invisible Menace, right, and West of Shanghai, these were all his thing. But so by the time it wasn't going to be a Karloff film, they were like too far into production to stop. Just get the thing made, just get it out. It's a B program, or let it go.
Yeah. But Vincent Sherman was very dedicated to it. I mean, he did in his short sketch. What's his name? Hickox was the DP. Excellent moving camera stuff. Excellent deep focus stuff. Nice little simple low budget scene where John Littell brings a rabbit back to life. I mean, it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all. It was better than much of the sort of lower grade Universal work in the 40s. I think the best thing about it is it really did have a good mystery. The hook of it was very interesting and very morbid. So I'm sure it appealed to the fans at the time.
And then he went on to a lot of great films in the 1940s, for sure.
Yeah, he was a good director.
Well, George,
without question.
George, in terms of this restoration, same kind of as the others.
Yes, all three films have this in common. We were able to retrieve the original camera negatives from the Library of Congress. There were some shots in some of the films where there was a hint of nitrate decomposition, and we substituted a shot from a second generation nitrate fine grain. But this was very, very rare.
One question for you, Constantine. Did you have to do a little bit of that same magic work on syncing this one up as well? And did you find any extra seconds or frames?
Actually, no, yeah, I did have to do the same thing. But in this particular case, I did not run across the good problems that we ran across with Walking Dead.
Okay.
So, everyone's seen, I guess, the original and only version of the Return of Dr.
There are a couple other extras on here: classic cartoons, Doggone, Modern, and Porky's Hotel, and the theatrical trailer. It's nice that these all have the trailer, George, because they're Warner Brothers films.
And I want to point out that we did not have a film element on the trailer of The Walking Dead. Very unusual post 1932 or so that we wouldn't have some kind of a trailer element on a Warner film. We're very good on trailers for Warner and MGM. For RKO, it's a rarity, and when you get deeper, like for Monogram films, it's almost impossible. But strangely, there was no film element on the Walking Dead trailer. And thankfully, a gentleman who's been a friend of mine since high school happened to have a 16 millimeter print of the trailer, because he is a meticulous collector, and he was kind enough to send it our way so that we could include it on the disc. It doesn't look great, but it's the trailer, and we're so lucky to have it.
Yeah, that's great news. Thanks, guys, for coming on and taking us through these.
Thank you, Tim.
As always.
All right.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. We have a couple other videos where we talk horror titles from the month of October that were released by the Warner Archive. So you can look for those on our YouTube channel. And if you're enjoying our videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That helps us out and lets us know that you're interested. Thanks for listening.